Hello and welcome to episode 12 of Why Postliberalism Failed. Today is September 13th, 2024. I'm James Patterson. With me is Tom Howes. And of course, we have our wonderful guest, Clara Piano. You're not quite Dr. Piano yet, right?
I am.
You're Dr. Piano. Okay. She is a visiting assistant professor of economics at Ole Miss. And her primary areas of research are family economics, law and economics, and public choice. And she also does a lot of work in Catholic social thought, which is the area that we'll spend some amount of time talking today. She is she is an expert in family policy, and has written and did a wonderful presentation here at Ave Maria last year on the subject. And we just had Clara Piano on, so I'm sorry, Clara. We just had Catherine McCulloch, excuse me, on, and she talked a fair amount about that. But before I go any further, welcome.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I've been watching these episodes, so it's
Oh,
a pleasure to be part of one.
excellent. Well, we're honored to have you. Given the, I mean, you're a pretty young scholar, but you're already making some pretty heavy, some pretty heavy work, on stuff like family policy. That's pretty impressive. So tell us about that policy work that you're doing.
Sure. Yeah. So when I became interested in this, I actually came to grad school with an interest in family economics. And at that time, it wasn't yet a hot policy issue. There wasn't really like the news stories of declining birth rates and declining populations. China still had their one child policy, things like this. So I thought it wouldn't be an interesting issue to most people. I enjoyed that about the topic. So I was a little bit concerned when it started to get a lot of attention. It's unfortunately become really clear recently that there's an underpopulation issue that we probably are already facing some challenges from, globally speaking. And I don't say underpopulation from like an objective stance. Like I don't think we can know like the exact number of people each couple or of babies, right, each couple should have. But I really like to think about it from the perspective of what individuals say about their desires. So just fertility is way below fertility desires. In terms of most people are not going to reach their family goals in terms of the size of family that they would like to have. So that is concerning to me. And so I've looked at various barriers to fertility, and the presentation that you spoke about at Ave was focused on economic freedom and how economic states with economic freedom can help potentially couples match with jobs that are more compatible with their family life. And so we should see more achievement of those family goals. And we do find that as work with Lyman Stone. And then I've done a little bit of work on looking at childcare regulations and how that might expand that gap between desired family size and then actual fertility. And we find that states that really are highly regulatory, and really kind of constraining a lot of options in that market, which might be just your neighbor, right, watching the local church, watching some kids, right, more kind of flexible arrangements that tends to push down, be associated with lower birth rates, I should say. So that's some of the work I've done. And then I've also done some work historically looking at Soviet family policy, which is pretty wild. So yeah, that's the work.
Very
Well,
cool. And
go ahead, Tom.
your sort of secondary interest is economics of religion, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you want to tell us a little bit about that? Because I don't think a lot of people know about the economics of religion, or they're not even sure what it is, too. So
Absolutely. No, I was thrilled when you pitched this idea of talking about the economics of religion, because it's a newer field, although I can talk about how old it actually is, right? But it's seen as a newer field. And the idea is just to look at the human side of religion, right? So I'm not talking about really theology, except insofar as it impacts maybe church structure or something like that, right? It's thinking about religion and how it could impact individual behavior, social phenomena, all of those things. So My husband and I tend to do work together in the economics of religion. We're both Catholics, and so we've been just interested in various topics in the Catholic Church, like the formation of seminaries. We're currently working on some projects with a data set with TLM and SSPX chapels across dioceses in the States. But yeah, economics of religion is usually of two types. So we could look at religion as the dependent variable, so trying to explain changes in religion, religious behavior or participation with various individual factors, economic theory, or as the independent variable. So trying to use religious belief maybe to explain something else that we observe in the world, like economic growth, right? How would religious belief maybe impact economic growth and the like? One of my favorite papers, I'll just mention it here. One of my favorite papers doing the first thing, so looking at how religion can be an outcome, is called When the Saints Come Marching In, and it's by Barrow McCleary, and they basically look at the determinants of adding beatifieds and canonizing individuals from the list of beatified people. And they argue that there's a strong role of competition between the Catholic Church and Protestant denominations. So in countries where there are flourishing Protestant churches, the Catholic Church is kind of furiously, like, they're, you know, beatifying like really rapidly and canonizing pretty rapidly. And then they don't find evidence of competition between the Catholic Church and the Orthodox churches, probably for obvious reasons, right? We share some of the same saints and things like that. So that's a cool example of some of the work in this field.
That's very interesting. James, do you have any questions on that?
I do. The thing that comes to mind when discussing that field is Tony Gill's work, although that might be more of a political science thing. Really just fabulous book. What's it? The Economic Origins of Religious Liberty. He had that book had a major impact on the way I think. In fact, it's going to probably show up in our book here on Postliberalism to explain why attempts to impose orthodoxy don't work. But in my case, the question I have is, is there any recent research on why religion's increasingly in the West an elite phenomenon? Like, why is it that like, you know, it used to be the stereotype was the only religious people are like dumb hicks and the sticks. They don't go to services or mass or anything like that. This is primarily like an upper middle class phenomenon. So I mean, you could, maybe you don't know, but if you have any is there any research on this that might answer the question?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, Tony Gill is a friend. He's great. I've been in a lot of panels with him. He does excellent work, and he's definitely an inspiration for our work as well, that my husband and I have done in this field. And specifically on the question of kind of thinking about religiosity across different like demographics, like socioeconomic groups. So Stark has written about a little bit about how it's really the middle class, and usually maybe a wealthy middle class, who tends to latch on to new religious movements and be able to propel them forward, right? So if you think about it from an economic perspective, if you are busy trying to survive and just get a paycheck, right, and you don't have a lot of time to spend, we would say maybe it's a luxury good, right? Being able to investigate new religious theories or denominations, groups, things like this, then you're less likely to see poor people represented. And then on the upper end, maybe you have a really high opportunity cost. So if you're super uber wealthy, then you sacrifice a lot of income then to spend time in religious participation. Maybe the benefits that you're receiving aren't as great because you already have, right, a lot of wealth. So it's really that middle class. They're searching, right? They have kind of high enough standards of living. They're searching for those other goods, though, whether or not it's belonging or spiritual goods. And so they find that in religion, generally speaking. Now, I have seen some recent polls that suggest, if we think about it by education, by like educational groups, more educated people actually do tend to be more religious. And so I think that's probably what you're referring to. And I don't know of any papers that have been directly written on this topic yet, so this would be just like speculation, but there probably is something going on with literacy, right, compared to historical rates, and then also just the fact that in terms of, you know, today we live in a very literate society, and the opportunity costs basically might not be as high for educated people. So like the idea, there's not a lot of how would I put it? I mean, there's competition in terms of like religious goods, but there aren't good substitutes, you know. And so you're engaged in finding like the best quality product, right? And so you're using that education to find that, like, whatever quality means to you, right? The best quality product. And so that's one way of thinking about it. Although I think this might be more of a United States phenomena. So like if you look at Europe, aside from certain denominations, which we can talk about, it seems to be very much the case that it's people who tend to have like low opportunity costs of their time, retired old women usually, right, who are attending religious functions, participating in religious services. So I don't know if that answers your question. I can think more about it in the background as we're talking, but that is an interesting thing that we do see in the data.
Yeah, no, those were great answers. And she's, by the way, answering this while I'm shoveling my lunch into my face because I have a very busy Friday. So if Clara was hesitating, it's probably because watching me eat on Zoom is probably not what she signed up for today.
You're fine.
So let's shift over to post-liberalism. What is it that interested you in our podcast, and what is it that you think maybe the economics might be able to contribute to the discussion of things like family policy, and also the arrangement that post-liberals tend to prefer, which is a kind of corporatism?
Ooh, so I'll try to keep it short. Basically, on the religious liberty front and the post-liberalism and kind of integralism, right, on those topics, just kind of knowing some history. So I'm a big fan of like John Paul II, so that's guided a lot of my interests, and just kind of being familiar with that history, specifically of the Soviet Union and communism. So the idea of, it's actually not that, you know, communism is trying to get rid of private property. It's trifectas: private property, religion, and the family. And so it's always been interesting to me to think about how all of those support each other, right? And they are all kind of dependent on one another. So I think religious liberty is essential if we want to have strong families, and that's something I care about. I think it's essential if we want to have strong faith. So I'll talk about a little bit about the literature in economics on like pluralism, we would say, on jurisdictions that allow for religious competition, and the outcomes that we see there. And there's pretty clear findings that competitive religious markets, so these are, right, states that allow for different religious groups to make their case in the public sphere, they actually tend to generate more religious kind of like belief and participation. So like a richer religious structure. And we can measure this in various ways. We can think of it as like higher quality, because if you think about a state religion or even a highly regulated religious market, that's like basically incentivizing the producers of religion to be lazy, not innovate, and not be responsive to the needs of the people, of the customers. Versus if there's a lot of alternatives, right? If, like, I live in Oxford, Mississippi, there are a lot of churches downtown. There's a Methodist church, a Baptist church, there's Presbyterian, there's Catholic church, right? You can take, they're literally right next to each other. You could walk out of one and go in the other, you know? So that actually incentivizes priests, pastors, religious communities to try to attract new members, right? And make those arguments. Provide services, be really responsive, right, to the congregations. And we can even do a throwback. Like if you, I don't know if you guys know about the argument between Hume and Adam Smith over this, if you've heard of okay, this is one of my favorite examples. So basically in The Wealth of Nations, even Adam Smith is talking about this. He's worried about there being a state religion because he says it'll make the preachers lazy, right? It's just going to make them not willing to innovate, lazy, and then religious participation will go down. And Hume is on the other side saying, we really want to have a state religion. And if you know anything about Hume, you're like, he's not a fan of religion.
It's
And
like
his
Richard
reasoning was
Dawkins'
like,
is cultural Christianity, I think, right? Richard
Yeah.
Dawkins says he's in favor of cultural Christianity.
basically, well, he was
Yeah.
saying people won't actually believe it then because it's going to be so low quality, so unconvincing. A state religion produces cultural kind of like sappy, like let's all sing kumbaya type stuff. And it'll be watered down and it won't have the same, fervor that you see in competitive religious markets. So I think that's a great kind of vignette of showing, how an economist would think about, right, pluralism and the danger maybe if you care about people, having access to religion and hearing religious arguments and conversion, like real conversion, then at least it seems clear to me from like the economic research that being in favor of more of a pluralistic, like more competition in the religious market makes sense. But and I can answer the family part of that, later, but
Yeah, I hit you with too much. I wanted so like a good I won't say good, but an integralist argument would be in response to this is that there's really no need for error in public life, and allowing for the introduction of error in the form of Protestant churches or any other religious denomination is really just luring people away, and the church prospered in the Middle Ages by imposing these kinds of approaches. And so why don't we just return, but with a V, right? R-E with a V to tradition, and start cracking some Protestant heads.
yes. So no, it's a fair point. So let me like steelman the case. It is a tragedy, right? And if any of us are building our life on misconceptions, on lies, on falsehoods, that's a tragedy. It's bad not to believe what is true, right? That being said, the question is then what environment though, so we're always thinking kind of about institutions as economists, what environment does lead to the clearest kind of portrayal, right, of what we would call orthodoxy, or like the best articulation of these ideas and the most convincing case, right, put to people, because we don't believe, right, in forced conversion. If you're part of the Catholic Church, that's not a belief, right? You cannot force conversion. And so then you would want to look at then what environment is conducive to the strongest case, right, for conversion. And there's been a lot of work done on the medieval church. Some of it is good because you can see that the medieval church was competing with a lot of really like heavy-handed political authorities, and there was also some cooperation with them, which is had less good effects and things like that. But what's pretty clear is that religious participation wasn't actually very high, and it wasn't actually very strong. So there's a famous paper that looks at, obviously there isn't good data, right? So this paper looks at sips of communion wine. So one of the requirements is the reception of communion in the Easter season, right? And so they try to study religious participation just by looking at the receipts of wine. So how much were these churches like spending on the bread and wine that's going to become the body and blood of Christ, and then how much participation can we infer from that? And it looks like it was pretty low, right? And there are other things going on, but this is something Rodney Stark has argued in his many books on the topic, that religious participation was pretty low until you see the Reformation. And then you see a lot of kind of creative thinking from the church, a lot of responses. Some of them don't work, like in Latin America. There's some liberation theology comes out of that. Gill has also written on this. And then they change their strategy though when they see, okay, this isn't appealing to anyone. Let me try this, right? And so let's maybe be more Pentecostal or just charismatic, right? And so changing the strategy, right? Keeping true to orthodoxy, but trying to actually serve, right, the people. in the community. So that's one response. And then, yeah, the other response would be obviously from not the economic perspective, but just thinking about it from a Catholic perspective is, and I think you've already discussed this, right? How do you deal with then Vatican II, religious liberty, and all of those arguments? So that's a little bit. Another good resource, though, if anyone is interested, who's watching, is Eklund Tullison. Eklund and Tullison, there's a third author, have a series of books on early Christianity and the Middle Ages, and then after the Reformation, from this perspective as well. And they look at basically the church as a monopolist and then being exposed to competition. Yeah.
What was the name of that book again?
So the economic origins of, I think they call it Roman Christianity, is the first book. And then there's the Marketplace for Christianity is their second book, I believe, or no, that's their third book. And then the second book is something about the medieval church. I'll have to send it. I'll have to send it to you guys after. I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's been a lot of studies, right, looking at this period in time, because there's fairly actually good. This is kudos to the Catholic Church. There's fairly good records of what was going on. We keep generally good records. And so you can see how various institutions were competing, collapsing, and the Reformation obviously was a big driver of a lot of this change.
Interesting. So would you say that among people who study this, there's a consensus that religiosity and religious participation was generally lower than we'd expect in the Middle Ages?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. That's definitely true. It was not an extremely exceptionally like religious age, right? Especially, and I think the other piece of this puzzle though is to, the comparison is often made to today. So this is something else that Rodney Stark has argued in his recent books, or relatively recent, which is that the secularization thesis is false. So it's not that we were actually becoming less religious over time as state religions collapse and as we grow wealthier. It seems to be, I think his view is that the share of people with religious beliefs is relatively constant over time. Religious participation might change a little bit, but that there's not really these huge swings like you hear it sometimes said, like we were so religious, the society was so Christian back then in terms of belief, and then not today. And it's worth noting that there were a lot of Protestant sects that really tried to enforce religion initially, right? So like force people to be, I think it was like Lutherans were like checking in on whether or not people were attending church, and this just did not have good outcomes. So
so the United States, right? It's pretty well known that the United States is sort of an outlier for religiosity. We're a very religious country compared to other developed countries. I suppose then that's sort of evidence in favor of their thesis about competition and pluralism, right? That we've been doing that for much longer than other countries, the other developed countries. Is that basically what they would argue?
Absolutely. And even Tocqueville talks about this a little bit. So like, it's well recognized for a very long time that the religious character of the United States is different, right? Because right off the bat, we did have some like state churches, but then pretty quickly we have religious toleration, and then there's pretty open competition. And so while you do see religious participation ebb and flow, it's always at a higher level than countries like the Scandinavian countries, Italy, right, Spain, Germany, that have had state churches or really heavy-handed regulation of religion. Those actually tend to be crippling them. And I mean, this isn't a paper, but if you look at the church in Germany today, it's funded. What we're always thinking about is, from the economic perspective, is like, what's your incentive, right, to serve other people? Like, is there a financial incentive to do that? And if you're funded by the state, you don't necessarily have that strong link of support from your congregation to you, to the provider of religious services, like the pastor or the priest, right? It's just coming from the state. So your incentive is actually to pay attention to the people who are writing your checks at the end of the day. So be more willing to cooperate with public authorities versus being kind of like attentive to what's going on in your congregation. There's obviously, maybe a happy medium. There are studies of, the differences in structure, organizational structure between Protestant churches, which are more decentralized, and the Catholic Church, which is hierarchical. But the Catholic Church does preserve things that keep, right, the parish priest responsive to the congregation to some extent, right? Weekly, right, donations, the basket going around. You can go to any other church and receive the same sacraments. They're still valid, no matter if the priest, right, is bad or good or whatever. So they're definitely, I think there's a rich literature for sure on how the structure of incentives can shape these outcomes as well.
Have you ever been contacted by bishops to talk about this stuff? I'm just curious.
No, although I will say, so right now we're working on 2 projects on the TLM. And one of our findings, our early findings in the literature, links vocations to the presence of a TLM Sunday Mass in a diocese. And so we are going to try to publicize it a bit more. Like, I think that's a little bit more useful maybe, right, for church officials. But our first paper is more just, for economists, right? It's like, oh, here's this difference. Let's try to explain it using economic reasoning. And specifically, it's called In Persona Christi Capitis. So it looks at the doctrine of In Persona Christi, which is Capitis, which is that the priest is in the role of Christ the head. And basically, this functionally means that we don't need to worry about the state of the priest's soul for the sacraments to still be valid, right? So like, you don't have to be like super monitoring your priest like you would in a Protestant congregation, right? The quality of his character is directly related to the quality of that religious product, right? The sermons and things like that. It's not the same in the church, right? There's actually this kind of protection that even if it's a bad, right? We've had bad priests, we've had bad popes, the sacraments are still valid. So you're still receiving a high quality good, but you need some monitoring, right? So if the priest, isn't necessarily monitored by the congregation because it's at the end of the day, right? All the same sacraments, you need some monitoring to make sure you don't have bad priests. And so that's why you tend to see very long, rigorous seminary training for Catholic priests compared to other denominations. That's kind of our answer. And you can see that at the time in history when the In Persona Christi Capitis doctrine takes place, right, really kind of takes shape. Obviously it was present, right, in the early church, but then it's like more clearly defined with Trent, and Augustine did some of the early work. You see seminaries popping up, right, at the exact same time. And so we see this as evidence for that as well.
No, that's amazing. I was just thinking, the reason I was thinking about this, I think you could do some, if any bishops are listening, you should probably hire her to get some help. Because I was actually surprised when I was over in England, I don't know how they do it in every diocese, but I was at this parish, and the priest said that basically his stipend for the whole year was like Christmas, and they were allowed to keep Christmas and Easter collections. And that was like covered the priest stipend for the whole year. So those priests would just get crazy competitive with getting people to come to their Christmas and Easter masses. And he was actually kind of angry at another priest who was the way he was advertising the Christmas mass there to draw people over there. But I'm wondering if that would be the best way to do it, if they're mostly if their main thing is focused on getting people there for Christmas and Easter. But I'm not, just something I thought about. But
yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of I don't want to say utility, but there's a lot of utility in thinking about the church as a firm. There really is, and thinking about how the incentive structures matter, right, for the behavior of priests. Because I mean, if you believe this stuff, it's the most important firm, right, in the world. So you should really care. You should really care, right, that it's working, it's functioning, and it's the oldest institution, so it has been doing a decent job, right, regardless of all of the shenanigans that go on. I think it's right. Chesterton says it's proof of its divine origins.
Mhm.
But it's really true, right? That there's definitely a wisdom in the church and the way that she does things on the human side of things, but also improvements that could be made. Another thing I wanted to say that came to mind when we were talking about competition, right? So I've been saying like competition is great, for religion. There are some papers in this literature that argue that and have some evidence that competition from secular institutions can have deleterious effects on religious participation and even for outcomes like alcohol and drug consumption. So specifically this paper looking at the repeal of the blue laws. So like on Sunday, when now you can, right, like go to the liquor store, or go shopping at the mall, or go to a sports event, or like, right, there's not necessarily like, there's more competition from secular activities than you see falls in religious participation. So it might be the case, I do think this is a young literature, but it might be the case that competition from other religious providers is salutary, whereas competition from secular activities is not as helpful, right, between the mall and the church.
I just want to note to the post-liberals who are watching how objective we are, that you've presented some of your findings that favor what we want to argue. And you've also presented some findings that would, favor their side of, their preference for blue laws, which aren't really integralist or post-liberal. They're just an old practice, even in the United States.
We'll
But still,
adopt an integralist standard and immediately subject you to the spiritual authority of the church by way of the temporal arm. Although I guess this would mean we'd have to get Mississippi to do so. I don't think the Mississippi government's really, listening to the diocese.
yeah. But we have blue laws. But you also said the Latin Mass was helping with vocations too. And I just go to, I'm fine with Latin Mass. I'm live and let live with Latin Mass versus Novo Ordo. But it's good that we were able to throw them some bones here, with this and affirm our objectivity.
We try. I think it's cool how this literature can surprise you. And I think that's what's really important is like the intellectual humility, just like you were saying, with like the liturgies of the church or other things. It's probably one of the things that I really try to keep, right? Because I'm talking about stuff that I care about deeply. But it's actually helped me realize that, there might not be, one right way to do all of these things in terms of, the various day-to-day right functions. And a lot of times it's responsive to the various constraints faced by the parishes and people, right, in their different situations. So yeah, it's interesting to see. An example of this is you tend to see when there's more religious competition. This is also something you tend to see stricter religious denominations. So this is also probably why TLM is more popular in like the States, right, compared to other countries, because they're distinguishing their brand, right? But there's also a need, and some of this comes from this famous finding in the literature called Sacrifice and Stigma, this paper, which is basically saying that there can be some free riding on religious provision of goods. So not only, providing like religious services, but religious communities provide a lot of things like meals when there's a newborn or, daycares and the like. And so there might be free riding people who don't want to contribute, but just like take those goods. And so you see more stigma required of people in the group. So like ashes on the forehead, or you can't eat meat, right, on Fridays. So practices that are stronger. And I think there's a little bit of resurgence of that type of thing in the States as well, right? As you want to distinguish yourself, but also the group is trying to weed out, right, who are those true believers, right? And then we're going to be providing the goods without having kind of the problem of free riding. So that's a little bit from the literature as well. But
James, I said last, you go ahead.
Oh yeah, so the so this topic of competition keeps coming up, and I think it's one of the elements of economics and of, I guess we would call it liberalism. It's one of the elements that a lot of post liberals really hate. They do not like the idea that there should be competition with the church. The church should have a monopoly, and then they get frustrated when the monopoly does not result in the outcomes that they want. And so they actually look for things to blame outside of the institution. But we see this carry over to their economic system. This was something that I mentioned earlier when I hit you with like 9 topics, the worst question I've ever asked on this podcast, and I'm very sorry about that. But this happens with corporatism, where they want to actually oversee through the government the operation of firms in a way that's supposed to, I don't know, align labor and ownership with government interests. So there were lots of regimes that did or tried to do this. You had Dolphus tried to do this in Austria. I mean, he didn't have much time before Nazis came in and shot him. But Franco tried it, right? Not only did Franco try it, he not only did he have a corporate estate, he had an autarky. He didn't want even competition for imports. He wanted Spain to produce everything. So why is it that there is this attraction to this? I mean, especially because the Catholic Church actually kind of liked corporatism. In Quadrissimo Anno, is that how you say that? More or less.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't.
We're so bad about pronouncing things on this show.
Yeah, it's those words that you only ever read, so you don't know how to say them out loud. Anyway, that's a trailing off way of asking the question, Claire. So that's my second worst question on the podcast, and I don't know what's wrong with me today.
No, you're fine. I think it's a difficult literature actually to talk about because it's so broad and there's so much that ties in, and it obviously has some overlap with Catholic social teaching, right? If you're thinking about it as a Catholic. So, like the idea of corporatism and kind of, we would say, heavy-handed regulation, right? So maybe we can agree. I mean, maybe an integralists don't or post-liberals don't, but like a state religion isn't ideal, but maybe some like support, subsidization, all of this kind of thing. And again, it doesn't seem to be that the data supports the hypothesis that regulation or subsidies, right, for the church end up generating what we really care about at the end of the day. And so I think it can be what economists tend to emphasize, right, is the role of unintended consequences of policy sometimes, because really often you can have well-intentioned policy, right? So like, oh, I don't mean to, have this impact on, on schools, but it's going to actually be bad for them or something like this. So like for public schools, right? I don't mean to necessarily, although this was the intent behind the policy, right? To punish religious education, but it tends to compete with religious education. And so I think that Catholic social thought does have some strands of favoring like labor unions or maybe signaling some of support for that type of an organization. But it tends to change, so it's not consistent. And I think actually Catholic social thought, I mean, it's just kind of young within the church, right? And so I think it's kind of being figured out over time. And what is pretty clear, and I know the John Paul II encyclical is the most, what is pretty clear is that a market economy, right, is supported. Religious liberty, right, has support from the church's perspective. And I think that it's just a matter of prudence, right? Really practical judgment, what we do with the other things, whether or not we want blue laws, right, in a state. That's where federalism actually, I think, comes into play and is really important, right? Because you can have states that try these types of things, right? Or maybe we want to have some taxes go to like charities that you can allocate towards, right, your church. This is kind of like the Italian model, the German model. So like, hey, federalism, could be a good answer for this, right? That's sort of what I would say. There's one other thing that I wanted to bring up a bit. Okay, this is what I wanted to bring up. So, and it relates to families. I think it's really crucial to remember that the institution charged from the church's perspective with carrying on the faith is not the state, it's the family. And so when you want to think about what types of conditions bring about, right, the best kind of maybe goals, right, more conversion, right, richer life in the church, right? Were people going to heaven, right? If that's the outcome we can define, then our focusing on the family is actually more fruitful. So there's a big literature, sociologists have gotten into this, and econ of religion a little bit too, showing how various familial practices can impact religiosity, right? And actually showing that like the rise of the nuns in the United States, a lot of people are disaffiliating, are coming from religious households, right? So what's going on there, right? We know that like religious affiliation in the church is actually shrinking. And so, and fertility, right, isn't going to make up for those lost members. So what can parents do? And one of the answers that I care about, like, right, as a parent is that it's helpful to have religious practices in the home. So not just going to services, but have religious practices in the home. There's evidence that helps children keep their religiosity. And then it's also helpful to have other adults in the community, like family friends who are religious, like beyond the parents, right? You don't want to be the only ones like preaching this stuff to the kids, right? So thinking about conversion, right, in an intergenerational perspective. And I think targeting maybe, and if you want to talk about policy, what types of policies foster that, right? What types of policies foster that, which seems to be a very effective way, right, to have higher rates of conversion, if that makes sense, right? To have less error in general as an outcome.
So I
I'm
suppose
like-
they say, oh, sorry, go on,
No,
James.
I am like desperately looking around my office. I'm trying to remember the name of the book that from the AEI scholar that did a great study on this about the relationship between family formation stability with religion. Do you know who it is? Does this ring a bell?
So Lyman Stone did a little bit of work for AI on religion. I'm not sure if this is the exact one because a lot of them do great work on these topics. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I didn't. I'm sorry. That was almost like a qual. That was almost like a quant. I'm not quant. It was almost like a PhD exam question I just gave you. It's like, you know, you're taking your comps. But yeah, I was trying to remember it because I wanted to bring up its findings, but so instead, now we're gonna have this awkward moment. I'm really contributing today.
Great,
I'm
James.
really putting in the effort.
James, you're MVP. So well, I was gonna say as dealing with the parent thing. Now, it's my understanding that the faith of the father has the most correlation with the faith of the children. Is that true?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So another
Okay.
really important finding, and I can share more like big hits from econ of religion that I just like want to publicize and want people to know because I think it's important to understand what's going on. To your question, yes, in the data, it seems to be that the faith of the mother, like her religiosity measured by her beliefs, but also like her practice and things like that, don't actually have a significant effect, like statistically significant effect on the faith of the children, which is interesting that you can't find that, right? But you see a very strong effect if the dad like is faithful and you know, in belief, practice, and all of these things. And obviously this means different things, right? He doesn't need to be a crusader, like he can just do it his own way. But then there is a very strong effect in predicting the religiosity of the children. So I think that that's a cool finding on this. But one thing, sorry to like circle back on this topic of the medieval church, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned something. This is a paper that combines what the church teaches about family and marriage with kind of outcomes that we can see for society. So there's a big literature right now looking at what is called the medieval church's marriage plan, or like family plan, which comes kind of from the Council of Trent, where free consent between the spouses is required for marriage. You cannot marry your kin. So there's the punishments, right? Banning of like degrees of like cousin marriage, which was a big practice, still is a big practice in non-Christianized societies. And then kind of looking at how this changed society. And the argument is I think the evidence is pretty convincing. There's psychological evidence, actually. There's evidence from democratic associations and economic growth that this policy of the church had massive impacts for the trajectory that Europe went on, in describing basically why Europe became wealthier than the rest of the world. they're pointing to, well, the church banned basically cousin marriage. This broke apart kin groups. This fostered trade across family lines and like across, right, kind of anonymous and personal trade, fostered economic growth and fostered also democratic associations. And so that's,
This
I
is like
think,
the Joseph Henrich kind of.
yes, yes,
Okay.
exactly. He's at Harvard. There's a professor at George Mason, Schultz, who does a lot of this work as well. And I just think it's such a cool literature because it helps us think about the medieval church and not like a, you know, again, not in a rose-colored glasses or, you know, with like emotions, but just looking at how church practice can change, right, the course of human history in a really positive direction. So I think that's a cool example. And I'm just pointing to the real importance of actually the church's teaching on marriage.
The book that I was desperately and awkwardly flailing for was How the West Really Lost God by Mary Eberstadt.
Ah.
Yeah, but so this the thing about the cousin marriage issue is that it's really become something dissociated from its origins, if that's the case, right? This is a real a barrier for a lot of understanding, even in things like foreign policy, where we went into places like Afghanistan and Iraq and we didn't understand kinship networks. So this is a major finding. This is also the first I've heard of it, but I'm not as up on this literature. But is this what you mean about unintended consequences when it comes to economics? Because this desire of post liberals is only ever to have intended consequences, right? Which is that if we have a monopoly of the church on the people, they'll only believe what they're told, and there will be only one thing telling them, and it'll be telling them the truth. What are the unintended consequences of trying to impose something like that?
Yeah, no, this is, I think, a really helpful way to put it, which is that thinking about here's what I would argue to post liberals is that you still would want to care about like this research because it's going to help you see maybe some blind spots, right? Some unintended consequences that might emerge, or it might help you see that, right? It might provide evidence in the contrary in some cases. And so some of the evidence though suggests basically that you would have, and I can just put this in these terms, if you have state religion, if you have, again, more of a heavy-handed role in promoting religion, it would be less convincing to people. We just see this over and over again. It's just a lower, we call it lower quality product, right, in the literature. But what that means is it's going to be less beautiful. It's going to be less trying to really capture the hearts and the minds, right, to turn the heart of people right towards God, and it's going to be more taking into account right where the funding is coming from ultimately, right, which would be from the state. So it's important. We always assume self-interest in economics. People give us crap for that, but it's better to assume self-interest than not. Especially, you don't want to assume benevolent state actors ever. I think that that's really crucial. And so I think that's part of what's going on there. Let me see. Did I answer that question? Remind me if there's like a part of it that I missed.
No, that was great.
Okay, there's one other interesting finding. If the viewers are interested in this, from the literature on the Catholic Church about the infallibility of the Pope, actually.
Oh no.
And yeah, and the argument actually goes, it's in favor. I've had some friends in grad school who are actually like surprised by this positively. They're not Catholic, but they thought it was kind of interesting. It helped this teaching make sense to them. And the argument goes, well, what does infallibility do from like an incentive perspective for future popes? What this means is that if once you kind of declare like, okay, papal infallibility as a policy of the church, a belief of the church, then that actually ties the hands of future popes. So it's saying we're committing, right, to this view of the faith, this orthodoxy, these doctrines, and future popes cannot, right, without losing all of their authority, they cannot actually kind of go outside of, right, what has been declared infallible already. So it's a way to constrain actually the seemingly, right, autocratic power of the Pope. So it's saying, actually, no, even from just the perspective of the economics of governance, the Pope isn't an autocrat. It's actually a constraint, this infallibility
So
feature.
it's like constitutional choice or whatever. It's like a constitutionalism that creates out of it.
Exactly. Yeah. So this paper was published in the Economics of Governance Journal. So it's an argument from public choice, right? That's, or like the economics of politics that's brought in, which is that we're tying our hands, right? We're making sure we don't actually have kind of autocratic popes. We're trying to put these constraints. And it's misleading because, like, saying that the Pope is infallible, well, that doesn't sound like a constraint, but it is, because it means all of the other popes were infallible. And so now you do have to, right, abide by their teaching. It's preserving, right, that tradition. So that's one argument. And again, this might be, more or less convincing, right, to people inside or outside of the church. But I've always found that kind of cool.
Yeah, that's really cool. Yeah, I suppose a tradition can kind of take the role of a written constitution in that sense. But having a strong tradition where there's something like you said, like infallibility, that
I think that's right. And I think we even see that at a micro level with like Catholic social teaching. Like, I think the various popes would like to say various things, but they're constrained in the sense by what their predecessors have said in encyclicals and other sorts of things. So yeah, it seems to be helpful. And again, economists actually do love studying the Catholic Church just because it's such a successful institution by a lot of measures. So it is neat to see how it survived so many different political empires, so many different challenges, adapted, right, the bureaucracy to so many different things, and play this role, right, in economic development.
That's amazing. Have you had a chance to read? There was like a new book out called Sacred Foundations.
I haven't, no.
I don't know, you've probably got some of that at grad school with those debates about the development of institutions with like North and all that, all those people, right? This professor is at Princeton University Press, argues against the sort of there's like two different schools of thought about how the modern territorial state developed. And she emphasizes how it was actually the church played a huge role in it, because the church had this sort of like proto state, a bureaucratic state structure that it had, like even the bishops had with beneath them, and also the Pope, and all the bureaucrats back then were like clerics. That's why it's called like clerical work, right? So when the state was in competition with the church, like for instance the fights between the French kings and the popes in the 1300s, the states were actually copying sort of the bureaucratic structure of the church to become more powerful. I thought it was really interesting. I was wondering if you had.
No, that sounds super plausible. So I am familiar with some work in this field, because it's a really, really, again, I can't emphasize, it's like a huge field now. It's growing really rapidly. And I think of the case of the School of Salamanca, actually, with regard to this. So this idea of competition between the church and the nation state. And I think it's crucial to emphasize that preserving that independence can have so many good outcomes, right? So like in the case of 16th century Spain, you saw that like the theologians and philosophers at the University of Salamanca, usually they were kind of spread around, but they were in competition with the political powers to some extent. And they were the ones trying to, promote the human rights of like the natives, or, various, again, exploitations that were going on in the New World with the conquest. Whereas the politicians will always have different interests, right? And even though, right, they might be seen as like very religious, right, Isabel and Ferdinand, they do have different goals just because they are in a different institution, right, than the church. And so that competition between those two things can be very healthy, and especially when it's pointing out something that's, right, not in the benefit of the state. And developing also out of that school, right, they developed some of the first economic theories and theories about money and inflation, and how the state can abuse, right, inflation and the like. So I think that that's, yeah, it's really important from a historical perspective. And then of course, today, like I'm sure there's, you know, like you were saying, there's some learning going on between these two institutions. But keeping those checks and balances today, right? And recognizing that combining two powers, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, that type of thing. But I wanted to can I throw in something else? So some of your episodes have talked about anti-Semitism and like that influencing some post-liberals or some of the thinkers, right, that are cited in this tradition. And there is a literature on the Jewish people and different practices and things like that as well in the economics of religion. And I think one of the cool papers, it's called The Economics of the Diaspora, tries to answer this question of why today, and what we would say maybe makes the Jews scapegoats in a lot of scenarios, politically speaking, throughout history, and kind of why today we see Jewish people investing in high human capital area professions. And the answer that they make, or they have the argument, is that that's what you can take with you when you need to leave town. So it makes sense throughout history. You don't see differences in places where there wasn't a lot of persecution. You actually don't see too high of a concentration of people from a like Jewish background in, you know, law or being a doctor or something like that. But where there's a lot of threat, right, that you might need to leave town, it makes sense for you to not invest in physical assets that you can't take with you. You're going to invest in what you can take with you, what you can carry, which is like your education, right, your human capital. And so I think that's really a helpful way of thinking about, right, just differences that we see in the world today between religious groups and understanding how actually persecution shapes some of those outcomes.
That's really interesting. I never even thought about that. James, do you have anything to say?
No, the account that I always heard was that because there's persecution sort of facilitates internal cooperation and sort of discourages disagreement. So I mean, Ashkenazi Jews are very famously disagreeable with each other, but they're very cooperative too. They have very high rates of capital in terms of interpersonal. But I had never heard of the idea of mobile personal competence as a way of preserving wealth. That's completely new to me. I feel like I have like a summer next summer where I just need to like read the greatest hits, just get like a reading list from you, because I think I've had my mind blown 4 different times here just by the citing of this stuff. The kinship thing has still kind of got me reeling, so this was a lot. So what do you got, Tom, or should we wrap it up?
Well, you know what? I want to wrap it up, but I want to ask one more question, because this would be probably the last time in a while we've had 2 economists on here. But you know, but I don't foresee us having another one anytime soon, although you're welcome to join us whenever you want. And so can Catherine, of course, if you're listening, Catherine. When economists talk about, you know, I've been dabbling in economics for years, mostly with the theory stuff, because I don't want to do math or modeling, anything like that. I just want to understand things. And it, you know, you apply it to political philosophy and policy and political ethics. So I have some thoughts on this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. When economists talk about self-interest, right, and how it's important to presuppose self-interest in all the models, right? You're not talking about selfishness, right? Like self-interest transcends both selfish people and not selfish people, right? What do you guys mean by self-interest?
Oh, absolutely. I love kind of talking about this because it bothers me as a misconception out there. And I see it all the time with my students. Basically, the idea behind self-interest is that, and I'm going to put it in the words of like Aquinas, man acts towards a perceived good or apparent good, right? We look for what looks good to us. And the apparent word is really important because it may not be actually good, right? I could act in a selfish way, which would not be good for me, but I think it's good. And so that's all we're assuming about human action. It's that humans perceive a good and then they try to attain it, right? They act towards it and they have to make trade-offs between goods, right, that they want. They're constrained, right, in various ways by reality, by budgets, right? But I do think that there's actually a much closer relationship between the kind of classical, or we would even say Thomist conception of human action and the one that economists have in mind when they're writing down their models. And now I would say that very often it's hard to measure, right, like what someone is perceiving as a good or trying to attain in a specific circumstance. So very often you assume something like profit maximization or wealth maximization. But the idea there is still, you know, if you're a church, you do want to make sure you are using all of your resources effectively. So there still is a lot of overlap, I think, between what we would call even benevolent action and then self-interested action, right? Those certainly, you can use self-interest to understand both selfish or benevolent actions. Economists tend to say, right, it's value neutral in that sense, right? We're just trying not to like judge, right, people's actions, but just saying, well, they're probably doing what looks good to them. And then how can we make sense of the social phenomena given that? Another way to put this is we never call something irrational, right? So, I mean, behavioral economists are different, but like most economists don't call something irrational. We try to make it intelligible, right? Try to make sense of it.
Because that's most people's actions are some intelligible goal that they're aiming for that they perceive to be good for them in some way. And that good for them can mean like good for their family, good for their community, because that's good for them.
Yeah,
Right.
so in my field, absolutely, in my field of family economics, the way we would even model it is basically the happiness of my children are a fact, they have a variable, they're like a factor in my happiness, like literally, right? And you can still come up with really cool insights, right, when you think about things this way.
So if you're like, so somebody who gives a lot of money to charity, when they go to the grocery store, they're still probably going to use coupons and try to save money and spend less on the you know, if they can get a cheaper version of the same good, they're going to go for that. And then that just means that they can give more money to charity at the end of the month. So they're still acting like the way the model predicts, right? As far as self-interest.
Yeah, no, exactly. Okay. Yeah, the idea is even if, and sometimes it's put like this, even if you're giving a lot to charity and it looks like it's making you less wealthy, right? So you're not maximizing wealth. Well, you're maximizing your utility, we would call it, or happiness, right? You are maximizing something. And so we can absolutely make sense of that. And you can absolutely make sense of, you know, even how saints, right, would act using this model and thinking about how they still had to work within the world, right? And there just are constraints, there are trade-offs that you have to make between goods in this world. And so that's going to be a helpful way of understanding when they make a decision versus not taking another path.
This is awesome. It's been an awesome hour. Thank you so much. And James, why don't you lead us, say your last words and just out.
Well, this has been mostly me learning, and I wasn't wasn't ready for some of the things that I learned, I suppose. I just want to thank our guest, Dr. Clara Piano, for bringing this this really immense wealth of wisdom and economic expertise to the podcast. I kept trying to get her to bag on post-liberalism, and because she's so relentlessly professional and a much better person than me, she instead decided to try to make post-liberalism better, which of course is probably the right path to take. So thank you so much for coming on Why Post-Liberalism Failed. We'll see you guys next week.
Thank you.